Good evening and welcome to the West Vancouver Sunshine Coast, See the Sky debate. You'll have to excuse me for one quick moment. I have a small problem here with my prompter. It stopped working. It'll be 2 seconds. Of course, that's the way that these things work when you're doing an online piece. There we go. Coming right back to you right now. Well, that was a perfect start, wasn't it? Good evening and welcome to the West Vancouver Sunshine Coast See the Sky riding edition of the 100 debates on the environment, which are taking place across Canada in over 100 communities. My name's Stuart McNish, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'm thrilled to be part of this extraordinary event. I host a television and internet interview program called Conversations That Matter. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to interview many experts on the environment and innovators in clean tech. And I'm always taken aback by the care, thoughtfulness, ingenuity, and inventiveness of these scientists, innovators, activists, and entrepreneurs who dream of a better world. I like to think of them in a quote that comes from George Bernard Shaw. So many of these people would say, you see that and ask why, but I dream things that never were. And I say, why not? These are people who envision a better world. So please allow me to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, lands that are home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. You know, our riding of West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, See the Sky covers many Indigenous lands, and each candidate will acknowledge the location from which they are participating. We also recognize the leadership of Indigenous people in sustaining our planet. You know, it's abundantly clear that Canadians care deeply about the environment, and that's why you're all here tonight. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the fact that Greater Vancouver and the Salish Sea are geographically beautiful. The quality of life that we have here is amazing. Clean, clear skies, remarkable air and water quality. But did you know that if you go back just 100 years ago, Vancouver was a dingy, dreary, polluted mess? But not anymore. And the reason the city cleaned up is because the people who live here wanted a better place to live, a place that is in harmony with the beauty of the land and the sea. The most important element to cleaning up Vancouver was the collective will of the people who asked for it. And it was their voices that if they weren't heard, well, then they demanded it. And eventually they got it. And when they did, we all benefited. And this is the same vision I believe that all of us have who are here tonight. We want to ensure that this precious blue marble in space we call home is cared for and will continue to be habitable for future generations to come. This is an evening of discussion, an evening of questions, questions that reflect national and regional perspectives. There are 3 questions of national importance that will be asked of the candidates tonight, and 4 from NGOs in different parts of this riding. This evening is a chance for us to listen to what the candidates have to say, to make note of their positions on these important issues. And the candidates, unfortunately, will not be able to take questions from you tonight due to the online format. We're broadcasting this event live to Facebook and on Zoom as a webinar, and it's also being recorded and can be viewed at 100debates.ca after we're finished. Tonight, 4 of the 5 candidates in the riding are joining us. Please allow me to introduce them to you before I turn the screen over to each of them one at a time. I'll start with the current Member of Parliament, Patrick Weiler of the Liberal Party of Canada. Sorry, Patrick, for not getting your last name quite correctly. Patrick was elected in this riding in 2019, and he is a lawyer by training who practiced environmental and Indigenous law before being elected. Patrick lives in West Vancouver. Joining Patrick tonight is Avi Lewis of the New Democratic Party of Canada. Avi is a documentary film producer and co-author of The Leap Manifesto, and he lives on the Sunshine Coast at Half Moon Bay. Joining Patrick and Avi is Michael Simpson of the Green Party of Canada. Michael has worked as a documentary filmmaker and was the executive director for the BC Council for International Cooperation. Michael lives on the Sunshine Coast at Elphinstone. And our fourth speaker, joining Patrick, Avi, and Michael, is Doug Bebb of the People's Party of Canada. Doug is a mechanical engineer and holds an MBA, and he is an outdoor enthusiast and lives in Whistler. I will now turn the screen over to the candidates in the order that I introduced them. Patrick, for the next 3 minutes, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to GreenPAC for hosting this important debate. I'm streaming in from my home on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And to answer your beginning question, yes, I actually sit on the All-Party Climate Caucus, and I really don't think climate should be a partisan issue. I'm not a very partisan person myself, and in fact, I've set up weekly meetings with members of all opposition parties since being elected. And one of the meetings I had with Jenica Atwin factored into her comfort in leaving the Greens to join the Liberals. I also work with all orders of government, meeting weekly and bi-weekly with the mayors, chiefs, MLAs, and the chairs of regional districts to coordinate action. And this is important because over half of our emissions are generated within municipal boundaries. And our net zero legislation, which is legislation I worked on to set legally binding emissions reduction targets, created a net zero advisory body. This is a non-political body of experts who are explicitly tasked with advising Parliament on the pathways to net zero by 2050. So yes, I strongly believe in cooperation across party lines, and I do it every day. But I do want to introduce myself to everyone here who may not know me. My name is Patrick. I grew up in West Vancouver in Sechelt. My mom was an environmental activist and my dad was a lawyer. So naturally I got into environmental law. And I've worked with First Nations and municipalities on environmental assessments, rights and title cases. And I've worked to bring about international cooperation on United Nations-led projects. And I know that collective action is possible because I've brought countries together to manage environmental issues in international water bodies. As an environmental lawyer, I was extremely frustrated with the unfair laws brought in by the Harper Conservatives. And I knew I could do more to change them as a legislator than I could as a lawyer. And so here I am. And I'm running again for the Liberal Party to be your representative because we're the only party that can and will act on the environment and climate. We finally have serious climate action in this country, and no government in the history of this country has done as much as us for the climate. We're pricing pollution, planting billions of trees, making record investments in renewables, and protecting 30% of our lands and waters. And when I talk to people in person, I ask them to put their hands up if they've read our climate plan. I've never seen more than 2 hands go up, but I encourage everyone to read it. It's long, it takes time, but it's real, comprehensive, and ambitious. And the experts agree. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the international authority on climate change. We rely on them to identify the problems, so we should also trust them with the solutions. Those very experts, Canada's own IPCC authors, have endorsed our plan. And I have nothing but respect for Avi and Mike in this space. They care about this fight, but all three of us know what the real problem is: the Conservatives' climate denialism. The Conservatives literally voted down a motion to recognize that climate change is real. And our government spent 4 years fighting every Conservative politician in the country just to put a price on pollution. And now they don't even bother to show up to a climate change debate. So the choice in this election is clear. The Conservatives, who are leading the polls, were the only party whose climate plan is endorsed by the very experts we rely on to track the climate crisis. That's us, the Liberal Party of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Mr. Lewis, I'd now like to ask you to take the screen for the next 3 minutes.
Stuart, can I just ask you a quick question, Stuart? My understanding was our opening statements were in the context of the first question about leadership and nonpartisanship, and I think Patrick spoke to that, but I don't think you read the question for the audience. I'm not sure.
Well,
I just want to make sure.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I was under the impression that you had an opening statement and that we would then go to that question. Would you prefer that we go to the question?
Our understanding was, I think that the first answer, the introductory statement, was in the context of this first question. So I think my colleagues feel the same.
You see, you know the format better than I do.
I've just hosted too many things in my life. I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. Well, let me ask that question then, because I'll turn to that in what I would like to call our question period. You have up to 3 minutes to answer it, as you know. I have the opportunity for you to, be warned of your time limit. on with a blue card at 20 seconds and a green card at 5 seconds. And so one final piece of housekeeping just before I get back to you, Abby, is that each of you candidates will have this wild card opportunity to respond. You can raise your hand and then we will allow you to give a rebuttal to each one of the responses if you choose to use that option. So the first question is Bill C-28. The federal government's bill introduced Bill C-28 on April 13th, 2021, with proposed updates to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
Sorry, Stuart, I'm so sorry to do this, but I think we all got a slightly different program. We had a question about leadership and the best way for Canadian elected officials to work collaboratively, and the question of an all-party climate caucus. And I think that's what we were all expecting for our first framing remarks. And I think we all kind of prepared something in that spirit.
Okay, I will go to that question. That's not the order that they were giving to me.
I'm sorry. Oh my God, this is so unpolite. I feel so sorry about this.
Okay, well, here we are. That's what the open dialogue is all about. We're about being flexible. Okay.
Mike, Patrick, if you want to weigh in any second, just back me up here. I think we're demonstrating all party consensus. Yes? Okay, cool.
Okay.
Got thumbs.
Our second question is focused, our first question then is focused on leadership. Namely, what is the best way for all Canadian elected officials to work collaboratively, regardless of party, regardless of partisanship, regardless of majority versus minority governments, and regardless of the level of government? How can we get the job done? Do you support the idea of an all-party caucus? And you're right, Abby. Patrick did speak to that, and I now turn the screen over to you.
Thank you, Stuart, and so sorry for all that. I think we have showed a little bit of cross-party solidarity at the outset. I am speaking to you from Whale Kwai, otherwise known as Half Moon Bay, on the traditional territory of the Sechelt people. So we are going to debate a lot of policy specifics tonight, but I would like to start from the big picture. We're in a climate emergency, and it's going to require greater and more rapid change than any of us have seen in our lifetime. Patrick talked about the IPCC, and its latest report is terrifying in the prediction that we may pass the point of no return on climate within the mandate of the next government or two, just a few short years. But for me, the IPCC report that truly articulated the scale of the climate challenge was the one in 2018, the report that detailed the necessity of keeping global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And that report said that to even have a chance of a safer future for all, we need, quote, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. That means this changes everything, which was the title of my 2015 film on the climate crisis. We need systems change in energy, in transportation, in housing, and buildings, all our public services, and the very nature of our capitalist consumption-based economy. And we have to do it on principles of justice. Vulnerable and historically marginalized communities who are the most excluded and the most exploited in the current economy must be centered in the way we make this historic shift. Not just because that's morally right. Justice is a strategic requirement too. We need to rapidly achieve a society-wide consensus on confronting this emergency. And that means the changes we make have to benefit working people in their daily lives starting immediately. I want to be honest. I don't believe there's a government anywhere on earth that's confronting this emergency with the urgency, scale, speed, and ambition required. For starters, governments need to tell the truth about the depth of change required. And we need solutions that get us off fossil fuels starting immediately, that build that massive consensus, social consensus for big change. But we also need what my grandfather David Lewis called in the 1940s, an all-in people's movement outside the gates of Parliament. And we need politicians who are connected to and accountable to that movement to hold the gate open and let the people in. And that is why I'm running, to be a people's accomplice, serving the climate movement from inside the halls of power. So yes, I absolutely support an all-party climate caucus. I want to build on the climate caucus within the federal NDP, and I'm ready to work with anyone and everyone in Parliament who understands the need for massive change and is ready to do it in a way that benefits the 99%. But we also need to keep pushing on the outside. We're out of time. All of us need to do whatever we can, not just in the next 13 days. On September 21, win or lose, I recommit myself to the struggle for climate justice because everything we love is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. Michael, I will now ask you to take the screen.
Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Simpson, and I'm with the Green Party, and I'm broadcasting or Zooming from Squamish territory. I live very close to Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, and it's a pleasure to be here. This question is excellent because it drives straight to the heart of the problem, which is that leadership for each one of us who is enthusiastic about climate change, and I'm sure everybody on this call knows very well why we must make some drastic and dramatic changes very quickly, also depends on party policy. This graph that I have behind me is the unequivocal science that we must follow. And what we've done in the Green Party is lock ourselves to the science. This top graph here, it just shows you that we have to reach a 60% below 2005 emissions target, and that's the science. So the Green Party is the only one that will do it, and each other party falls short. It's sad that actually the Conservatives are not here tonight to justify why their target is so low. This last one is the sad truth of where we are after so many years of NDP, Liberal, and Conservative governments. We're 27% below the emissions targets that we need to be at, and that's in British Columbia. So yes, I think Avi is correct, and so is Patrick. We do need that dramatic action on climate change right now. And what we've proposed in the Green Party has been very consistent. We've not just called for an all-party caucus, we've actually called for an all-party cabinet that we would be made up as if it was a war cabinet, as if we were actually going, as they did in the Second World War, forward with an extreme emergency in which we must all cooperate together. This is my major message tonight, is that we actually have no time to quibble. We need your best ideas, Avi. We need your personal commitment. Everybody needs that, like with both Patrick, Avi, anybody who's going to get on board. We need the ideas, and we need to move forward with a facilitated leadership that can bring these ideas together so that we're not banging heads, but we're rising above the occasion to figure out what are the creative ideas to move forward. So unfortunately, the problem with the NDP, Avi, is that you must answer to your party, which will not say no to fracking. Avi, your party will not say no to old growth logging. Patrick, your party bought a pipeline. It's the dirtiest oil in the world, the TMX. And as for John, they refused, they pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. We need to get the heads in the parties together, but we also need to hold people accountable. And this is key. We need to hold parties accountable, because at the end of the day, party policy is what drives us into this negative territory. There was all sorts of ambition that the Liberal Party put forward, but they missed, as of the Conservatives, 9 emissions targets in a row. So there's been plenty of good talk, plenty of good policy, but not the walk that we need. The Green Party needs to be in Parliament to do what we do best, which is to hold people accountable. There is no escape from the physics of what we're doing, and 60% above the target is the minimum. In fact, Climate Action Network and groups like the David Suzuki Foundation are not only pointing out that that's the target, but Canada's obligation when it comes to the world carbon budget is even higher. They're talking numbers like 140%. And that means we need to help other countries which are not in the position that we are in Canada to do their best to solve this problem as well. So I hope you will consider that and vote Green.
Thank you, Michael. And Doug, I now turn the screen over to you.
Unmute. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you to Green Pack for arranging this debate, to Lisa Brasso for making it all happen, and to Stuart for moderating. I'm Doug Bebb, your People's Party candidate for this 44th Canadian general election. The People's Party cares deeply about the environment and is focused on the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the soil in which we grow our food. These things are the tried and true staples of environmentalism. We simply cannot allow our environment to become an unhealthy, toxic soup of chemicals, and the PPC will prevent this from happening. The PPC, the People's Party, differs with all the other establishment parties on the topic of the so-called climate emergency. We have our differences, but let's start with our many points of agreement. The People's Party agrees that the climate is always changing. We agree that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, without which life on Earth is not possible. We agree that adding CO2 to the atmosphere should cause some warming. The CO2 in the atmosphere has been increasing since the end of the Little Ice Age. And over the past 2 centuries, the temperature of the Earth has increased by about 1 degree centigrade. But only since 1960 has man's contribution to greenhouse gas been sufficient to play a role. Though we agree on all these things. But the fact is that no confident prediction about future mean temperature or its impact can be made. The IPCC, which is referred to quite frequently in these debates, acknowledged in its own 2007 report that, quote, the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. And it's not possible to use it as a policy tool because it's not an accurate prediction. For these reasons and many others, the People's Party holds the position that there is no imminent catastrophe requiring radical actions that will destroy our prosperity. We consider this to be a monumental blunder. There's plenty of time to consider alternative courses of action, including mitigation, should that become necessary. And if past modeling inaccuracy is any guide, this is quite unlikely. The People's Party rejection of the premise that climate emergency exists requires me to answer the questions here tonight in a different fashion from all the establishment parties. So I look forward to a very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Well, I'm now going to go back to what I thought was the first question. Avi, I'm going to start with you, which had been the order that I was going to start to rotate first responses, and that being the question of Bill C-28. The federal government introduced Bill C-28 on April 13, 2021, with proposed updates to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. This is the legislative framework for federal action to protect human health and the environment from pollution and toxics. The bill would be, for the first time in Canadian law, a recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. The bill was not passed before the election was called. So here's the question. If elected, will you prioritize Bill C-28 for debate and enable its referral to committee for consideration of strengthening amendments as soon as possible?
Thank you, Stuart. And I promise I will no longer interfere in your hosting, which is excellent. Sorry about the teleprompter off the top. It happens to me all the time. Happened to me on live television all the time in the late 90s.
Yeah,
I just want to remark briefly that it is we can't just go ahead and not acknowledge the extreme cognitive dissonance and discomfort of having a climate denier at this debate. Doug, we've been in a few debates together. I'm sure you're a perfectly nice person, but the planet has moved on from the fossil fuel funded climate denialism that you are spouting tonight. They're recycled talking points of fake science. They have no place in a serious debate 13 days from a snap election in the middle of a climate catastrophe. And I just want to register and recognize and see the audience's discomfort with having to listen to these talking points, which were developed and funded by the fossil fuel industry in the interest of prolonging this crisis and prolonging their excessive and grotesque profitability. On the question of Bill C-28, it's true, the Environmental Protection Act needs updating. It's all over 20 years since it was created. And I strongly support it, as does the NDP, going into committee and getting amended. There's some very problematic clauses in the current version of the bill that allow for the consideration of economic interests, which could trump the needs of frontline communities in the bill as it stands. And so when the Parliament comes back, you can expect the NDP to fight forcefully to improve that bill. This is a bill that can be about fighting environmental racism. This is a bill that can be about protecting the rights of frontline communities, like in Chemical Alley, the First Nations around Sarnia, like in Grassy Narrows in Northern Ontario. I was honored to be asked to speak at the Grassy Narrows River Run in 2016, continuing a fight that my father, Stephen Lewis, as an NDP leader in the province of Ontario in the 1970s, began for the Grassy Narrows First Nation, which was poisoned by decades of pulp and paper, mercury effluent in the English Wabigoon River system. There are communities across this country which are being poisoned by industrial activity, especially by the tar sands and the First Nations, not just around Fort Mac, but around Lac La Biche and the other significant deposits where the Beaver Lake Cree, which I spent a lot of time with Crystal Lehman in the shooting of This Changes Everything, with that community on the front lines of fossil fuel extraction. The NDP is calling for the creation of an Office of Environmental Justice, which would put in focus the environmental racism of industrial activity all across this land. And we also need a national crisis strategy, which is also in the NDP platform, to help communities plan for and adapt to climate impacts and weather extremes, but also for remote and vulnerable and Indigenous communities. We need long-term funding, and we need justice for communities that are being poisoned. And we need a government that has the courage to take on big polluters. Only the NDP has displayed that courage from the time of my father and my grandfather on. Thank you.
Well, Doug, I have you next in the rundown to respond to this question about Bill C-28. The screen is yours.
Okay, well, at first, I guess I must address Avi's remarks. I want to make it perfectly clear that the PPC takes no money from industry, fossil fuel or otherwise. And in fact, we would eliminate all subsidies to fossil fuel. Leadership on the issue of the environment must come from within Canada. We cannot allow Canada to be subjugated to the control by the United Nations and the World Economic Forum of the lunatic Klaus Schwab, these very globalist foreign interests that Avi represents. These foreign-controlled globalist organizations do not have Canada's best interest at heart. Their influence must be removed from Canadian policymaking at all levels. The astute observer will recognize that all of Trudeau's recent policy has been forced upon us by these international globalist interests. All of it. All of the policies are given to him and foisted upon Canada. The PPC will reverse this disturbing trend and begin making policy in Canada for the benefit of Canadians. And further, on the topic of leadership, we heard Mike Simpson talk about David Suzuki. And I wish to extend my condolences to Mr. Simpson of the Green Party, who was just stabbed in the back today by David Suzuki and other Green Party representatives when they threw their support to Abby Simpson of the NDP. Clearly, the Green Party lacks the leadership to accomplish much of anything aside from internal division and bickering. And I would be very interested to hear Mr. Lewis's account of how long he's been conspiring with Suzuki to pull off this little stunt. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug. And Michael, the screen is now yours.
Well, thank you. I won't comment on that little stunt. I'll let people decide for themselves what's valuable in a healthy political discourse and what is not. What I'd like to comment on is the question. And the problem here, folks, is that we have 10 million new chemicals a year that are introduced into our anthropogenic space, if you could call it that. So what does that work out to? Because that's a really huge statistic. What it means is that it's 1,000 new chemicals an hour. So by the time that this debate is over, there will be 2,000 new chemicals that we need to figure out. And the question is, how do you regulate that? And so, yes, we obviously need to update the policies that we have on this. And so what I wanted to mention, though, and this is really key, is you can't just update legislation. We have so many pieces of legislation that are reasonably good, but there's no means to enforce them. And the reason there's no ability to enforce them, and we shouldn't forget this, is that because governments like the Harper government, and Patrick's right tonight, that it's a darn shame that John Wesson isn't here, because they need to answer for the years in which they absolutely gutted Environment Canada. And if you were in Ottawa at the time, and I was there in Ottawa at the time, and I watched the people leaving their jobs and just absolutely downcast and dissuaded, because if you bring 1,000 new chemicals along every hour and there's nobody there to be able to deal with it, well, what happens? And that's our problem, people, is that if you bring in legislation, you must uphold it. And it's the same thing we're saying about climate change tonight. If we bring in the legislation, we also need to empower government and everybody to uphold that legislation. So enforcement's absolutely key. The other thing I did want to mention is that any member of parliament on the West Coast is also responsible for issues that are national in nature and that we may not face here. In British Columbia, we have a moratorium on nuclear energy, but we don't in Eastern Canada and Central Canada. And just to give you an idea of why radionuclides are so darn important for us to take into account, we have enough radioactive waste in Canada to fill 7 hockey rinks up to the boards with absolutely deadly radioactive waste. This is stuff that will have a half-life of over 600,000 years, and Homo sapiens have only been around for 200. So imagine even writing the signs to say this stuff's dangerous, don't touch it. And we have absolutely no place to put it. So people are now proposing that we put the waste from the Bruce nuclear energy into right next to the Great Lakes, a mile from all of the water of the Great Lakes. Is that a brainy idea? You see our problem as a species, we are accumulating and creating new things all the time, but without a properly financed government with the proper legislation in place, we can't regulate this stuff and people go wild. They create this stuff and then we have to deal with it for not just our generation, but generations to come. So in a few minutes, you're going to hear me talk about a future generations commissioner. You're going to hear me talk about why we need to protect not just our generation, but future generations as they have done in other countries like Wales, because nobody has the right to create this many chemicals and has the right to create radionuclides that are going to endanger not just our generation, but hundreds of generations that come after us.
Thank you, Michael. Patrick, I turn the screen over to you now to wrap up the responses to the question with regards to Bill C-28.
Gladly, Stuart. And I just want to start by addressing something that Doug mentioned about foreign interests controlling Canada's the actions that we take as a country, and I find that pretty offensive to hear that myself as well. Canada is an active participant in the United Nations and all of its agencies, and these are the agencies we absolutely need to deal with some of the biggest environmental problems that we have in the world that require collective action. Whether that's climate change, whether that's fishing in the high seas, whether that's the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which is one I've had a chance to speak at a conference of the parties of. Collective action is important. It's actually critical, and Canada plays a huge role, actually an outsized role in the international scene. And so I would take issue with that. But to the question, I would absolutely prioritize that as an environmental lawyer myself. Of course, I support this. I got into this job in order to strengthen environmental laws. And actually in the 2019 election, I was a signatory to the Blue Dot campaign, which was a commitment to bring in laws that ensure a right to a healthy environment. And that's exactly what the modernization to SEPA has, which, over 2 decades in the making. But unfortunately, after it was tabled, we weren't able to actually get it to debate in the House. I was very much looking forward to debating this, but it got blocked by opposition. This is one of the problems we were facing throughout the entire calendar year, where opposition very much filibustered bills getting to the floor and to committee. And alas, that's what's happened here. And that's on its own a really important reason for why we need this election, so we can actually move forward with these important pieces of legislation that we need to pass, because SEPA modernization is one of the most important things we can do for the environment. In many people's opinion, it's actually our most important environmental law. So absolutely, I would prioritize bringing it back. There's ways we can strengthen it. But that's what happens when you get things into debates, and that's what happens when you get things into committee. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that yet. We're going to go further than this legislation as well. We're also committing to require that consumer products, such as cosmetic and cleaning products, come along with the information that people need to understand what's in them. And we're going to bring in a whole host of other measures to phase out toxicity and testing in animals, and a number of other actions to better protect Canadians and the environment. So absolutely, this is something I look forward to prioritizing when we get back to Ottawa. And I think this is one of the most important pieces of law to do that.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll now go to our third question, which is focused on Indigenous rights. Indigenous people can and should play a critical role in environmental solutions. Will you implement the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples? And calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Will you invest in Indigenous-led land use planning and the establishment of Indigenous protected and conserved areas? So I will start with you, Michael. It's your turn to lead responses to this question.
Well, the short answer is, of course, yes. UNDRIP is actually enshrined in law as of June in Canada, and the one of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, of course, to uphold UNDRIP. What I want to talk about tonight is the government's record on this, and I want to talk about both the Liberals and the NDP, because I find it incredibly disappointing. Patrick, I know you're an Aboriginal lawyer, and this is an area of concern to you personally. But you stood up in February of 2020, and you said to the people of Canada that you were so proud of consultation on the TMX. Nothing, in fact, the exact quote is on behind me. I don't know if you can see that, but basically it says that nothing had been done like it in Canada at all. What I don't understand is that the Squamish Nation is taking you to court. They're taking you to court, and the very subject, I read through the Supreme Court ruling, and the very subject is that there wasn't enough consultation. And the Supreme Court judge says that holding consultation and never saying no to a project is not consultation. And so the Squamish people are still taking you to court. They still don't want that pipeline, and you're still pushing it through. You say you're not whipped because I've told you before that you're whipped in your party. It doesn't matter what you personally think, and you say you're not. But what did you vote for? Did you vote for that budget? And the bottom line is you voted for that budget with the TMX pipeline. So you are whipped, my friend. Avi, I can't let you off the hook either, my friend, because NDP have also been taken to court by the Blueberry Nation. And you say that you're into upholding Indigenous rights and hearing from Indigenous people. Well, it's Indigenous people that took the NDP to court and said that they have a right not to be exploited the way they are, and for the fracked gas, to be able to say no to fracked gas and no to LNG. Any environmentalist in our riding knows that we cannot have LNG, not in a climate change era. And when the Blueberry Nation stands up and says no, they're saying no to you and your party. And you got to come to grips with that, because you can't on one hand say that you're for Indigenous rights and then not hear them on the other hand. Also, the Squamish Nation in our riding has unequivocally said, and you also need to hear this, Avi, they've said no, an absolute moratorium on old growth logging, and it's you and the NDP that are currently arresting people in Fairy Creek. So you folks, you can't stand up in front of I got to hold you accountable, and that's what we do in the Green Party. Our job is to say to you, if you're going to stand up and say something, you need to uphold it, not just with legislation, but with actions. And in both cases, neither of you have taken actions, and your parties have not taken actions on these things which are fundamental to upholding UNDRIP.
Thank you, Michael. And Patrick, I turn the screen back over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, I just, as someone that comes into this work from an environmental and Aboriginal law background, obviously I feel very strongly about this. And a lack of action pre-2015 is what actually pushed me into this role. You know, to Mike's point, I had the opportunity to work with the Squamish Nation on a nation-led environmental assessment process because the nation didn't trust the province or the federal government in how they were assessing projects. To Mike's other point, I actually also had the opportunity to work for the Blueberry River First Nation to help it grapple with unchecked fracking in their territory that didn't consider the cumulative effects. And now the new case law, just recently from a few months ago, has now changed that and requiring the province to take new steps to actually consider this. So I'm especially proud of what we've been able to do since being elected. We've been able to pass UNDRIP into law. This is the most progressive piece of legislation on reconciliation in our country's history. We've been able to implement 80% of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, including that one, which was a key part of it as well. We launched the Indigenous Guardians program pilot in 2017, and helped establish some of Canada's first ever Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And today there's over 33 funded projects under that program right across the country. In the budget passed this year, no, it does not have new measures for TMX, but it does have $340 million in funding for new Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So I'm in active discussions within our riding to actually establish a new Indigenous Guardians program. I can't go into the details right now, but it's happening and it's moving ahead. And so it's something to look forward to in the coming months. First Nations in this riding have long had land use plans in place and have been strong stewards of the environment, the lands and waters since time immemorial. And I want to give two examples, both of the Seychelles Nation in managing the SWIA, as well as the Squamish Land Use Plan. And these nations know that I have and will continue to be a strong advocate for action to implement these plans. So a lot has been accomplished in the last 2 years, in really the last 6 years, very much changed the face of how consultation and accommodation has taken place in this country. And Mike, to your point, I had an opportunity to work on that specific file you're talking about. And the fact of the matter is the approval of that project was unlawful at first because of the very reason the consultation and accommodation was insufficient. After that point, the government actually brought in a new robust consultation process that went the entire span of that project and met with every community along the way. So those comments were very much taken out of context. That is the type of consultation and accommodation we need to see in this country. And that's exactly the type of consultation we've seen in the last 6 years.
Thank you, Patrick. Avi, I'd now like to turn the screen over to you.
Thank you. I think we're clearly entering into the partisan bickering part of the evening. I think that's unfortunate, Mike. You know that we're running in a federal election. You know, because I've said that there are respectful differences between the federal and provincial NDPs, and you know my position on old growth and on fossil fuel infrastructure in general, and we'll get to all that. This question was about Indigenous rights, and I'll stick to that. I come from a social movement background, and a formative experience in my life was the LEAP manifesto in 2015. The LEAP started by citing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action. Only Liberals say that 80% of those calls to action have been implemented. Most of us know that a fraction of them have, and the hard ones are all left undone. The LEAP process and the LEAP manifesto itself was anchored in Indigenous leadership, and it called for implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People before any party had it in their platform. I want to quote from the LEAP because this is the kind of teaching that has informed my work. Moved by the treaties that form the legal basis of this country and bind us to share the land, for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, we want energy sources that will last for time immemorial and never run out or poison the land. Indigenous land rights are themselves a climate solution. The magnificent young group Indigenous Climate Action has made this their mission to try to explain this to settler colonial society, that Indigenous protection of Indigenous lands and territories are critical climate mitigation strategies. That's a quote from Indigenous Climate Action. And let's remember, there was a report out just a few weeks ago, last month, by the Indigenous Environmental Network in the United States and Oil Change International that looked at 26 Indigenous frontline struggles against fossil fuel projects and found that Indigenous resistance to those projects like TMX, like Northern Gateway, like Coastal GasLink, has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions. And so we owe a great debt to frontline Indigenous communities that have been keeping carbon in the ground. But there's a deeper question here too. We're in a crisis of narrative. The colonial mindset that claimed a God-given right to steal children, steal land, and steal resources was the same logic that built an economy based on limitless extraction and consumption and created the climate catastrophe. For more than 150 years, settlers have taken the riches of this stolen land and turned them into money. And in the 21st century, we simply can no longer afford that 19th century thinking. We need to build a new economy in a hurry. The NDP platform has a $500 million Indigenous Guardians program, more ambitious than the Liberal one, that would establish Indigenous-led land use planning and Indigenous protected and conserved areas well beyond the incremental first pilot projects that the Liberal government has announced, and create economic development pathways based on protecting nature rather than extracting from it. We need an economy based on caring for the earth and caring for one another.
Thank you, Avi. And Doug, I will ask you to wrap up on this question about UNDRIP and Indigenous participation in protecting the environment.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity. My remarks on that are going to be brief. So I'm going to first say that Patrick says he finds criticism of his party's kowtowing to globalist interests offensive. And perhaps that's why he and his Liberals have introduced bills to censor Canadian speech on the internet and elsewhere. These bills are just recently passed in various stages of the process. But the fact of the matter remains that the Liberals want to make sure that no narrative comes out that doesn't agree with their globalist goals. Now, that being said, I'd like to say that I find myself agreeing with Patrick on the issue of consultation with our native populations. I think they've done a good job with TMX, and that should be the model going forward. We can build more pipelines. We can avail ourselves of the hydrocarbon advantage that we have and do it in a way that benefits our native populations and in a fashion that suits their needs. And so that's just fine with me. The idea that, we can just eliminate fossil fuels completely in short order is just badly misguided. I mean, if you really have concerns about carbon dioxide, and I don't, but if you do, then nuclear is clearly the way to go. And yet the Green Party has in its platform, anti-nuclear, anti-everything. Frankly, they're just perennial malcontents who like nothing. And so on to this other question. The rights of Indigenous peoples are important. Truth and reconciliation seems reasonable to me. Again, though, we come to this issue of globalist meddling in Canadian affairs. So the answer to my question on the question on the UNDRIP stuff is no. And many Indigenous people in Canada have come to the conclusion that adding a layer of foreign control is really not in their interests. We need a solution that puts control back into local hands, not into the hands of a globalist elite who only want to enrich themselves. And Avi seems fine with that, It just seems bizarre that a party like the NDP, who is dedicated to protecting the working man, is so deeply in bed with globalists. Anyways, the People's Party will reduce Canada's participation in the United Nations programs to the bare minimum. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. So we now turn to our local debate questions. These questions have been sourced from local environmental nonprofit organizations throughout the riding. All areas of the riding are represented with a variety of issues addressed. So allow me to start with a question from the Future of Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative. This society facilitates and supports the organizing and planning of complex activities that bring allegiance to balancing development, conservation, and equity in the region. Their question is, the natural capital of the Akatsum Howe Sound watershed is priceless. It provides clean drinking water, trees, estuaries, and grass sponge reefs that sequester carbon and provide important habitat for hundreds of species. Creeks, rivers, and streams are essential to sustaining the life of our salmon. How would you influence changes to existing legislation to better protect our rivers, streams, estuaries, and oceans to respond to worsening impacts of climate change? Avi, I'll start with you.
This is a fantastic question, and I appreciate the work of the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative, which is culminating shortly. So the first meeting that I had when I decided to run for office was with the Squamish Streamkeepers. And I've been moved and inspired by the work of local communities in protecting rivers and streams and estuaries in our ocean, and the keystone salmon on which so much coastal life depends. It's heartbreaking to see a handful of volunteers on the front lines of protecting these vital habitats, scooping salmon fry out of streams that have become puddles in the heat waves and drought of the climate emergency and carrying them by bucket to deeper waters. So in the spirit of transformative change that we need in this crisis, I don't think there's existing legislation we can tweak to meet this massive challenge. The NDP is proposing a civilian climate corps, a Green New Deal program modeled on the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, in which millions of young people employed directly by the US government planted billions of trees and built the national park system of our neighbor to the south. A civilian climate corps could address the youth unemployment crisis by putting tens of thousands of young people to work in climate solutions like green infrastructure and conservation. It would take the work of local streamkeepers to scale in a hurry, bringing huge numbers of reinforcements to those heroic volunteer efforts, restoring salmon habitats, riparian areas, doing wildfire prevention work, and helping sequester carbon with natural solutions. It could also take to scale the cleanup of ocean plastics. I don't know if you guys saw this story in the Vancouver Sun, but there was a program in the spring of 2020 that did exactly this. A couple of tourism operators here on the coast, which had just upgraded their fleets and hired new staff, and they got shut down by the pandemic in March of 2020. So these two business owners approached the federal government and offered to use their people in their new boats to clean up ocean plastics. The Fed said, great idea, but there's no money. Remember, no money in a year, but the government spent $350 billion on pandemic supports. So these tourism operators approached the province, and the BC government stepped up and funded a major cleanup effort that ended up cleaning up 127 tons of ocean plastic. But even more meaningful was the sense of community and purpose that those tourism operators and their crews discovered in doing this crucial work. We need policy that acknowledges that humans are connected by the natural systems on which we depend, and that learning to live with each other and the earth is a survival strategy. We have to repair our fundamental relationship with nature. We also have to strengthen enforcement of the Species at Risk Act and really put nature first in our policy solutions. All of life is at risk in the climate emergency, and all of our crises are connected. So we need solutions that multi-solve, and I'm proud to be running on policies like the Civilian Climate Corps that would address exactly that need.
Thank you, Avi. Patrick, I turn the screen back to you.
Thank you, Stuart. And as someone who grew up in BC and who has worked on river and ocean management in Canada and in 19 other countries around the world, this is something that I'm really passionate about. And our government in the last 6 years has done more to protect our oceans than any government in Canadian history. But let's think back to when John Weston, our Conservative candidate, was MP. He was claiming we had a world-class oil spill response system as the beaches in West Vancouver were literally shut down to the public because of the oil spill washing up on our shores from the Maratha ship. Now they also want to revive Northern Gateway. And this is really what conservative climate action looks like. But here's what it looks like to us. On September 18th, thanks to the community's advocacy and the Howe Sound Biosphere Initiative and the determined efforts of so many, Howe Sound is going to be recognized as UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. I was very proud to play a small part in this, in bringing the federal government on side and get it over the finish line, and to be able to support some of the work over the last few years on creating new marine protected areas. And I know my predecessor did a tremendous amount of work to protect those unique glass sponge reefs that you find in Howe Sound. As the chair of our caucus in BC, I've personally advocated every single day or every single week for 6 months to our cabinet to have a recovery package for wild salmon. And with that, we were able to deliver in this year's budget with a $647 million investment into the Pacific Salmon Strategy, which is the largest investment in the conservation of a species in Canadian history, and is going to help arrest the decline of many imperiled stocks. Over the last 6 years, we've also launched the Ocean Protection Plan, which has brought into place world-class shipping safety. We've strengthened protections for our coasts and marine life. When we've opened or reopened Coast Guard stations, including the Kitsilano Coast Guard Station, and hired 3 new DFO officers in Squamish. So we went from 1% of our oceans being protected in 2015 to having almost 14% today, and we're going to get to 30% by 2030. Avi mentioned an interesting policy brought in, or with the tourism operators. We actually invested another $8 million in our Ghost Gear Fund, and that's led to 25 projects right across BC that's actually cleaning up gear that's left by oceans. So there, we can go further in creating some new laws. I do see some areas for improvement, particularly how we look at riparian areas management and how we deal with the province. And we're going to continue to review and expand things like the Coastal Restoration Fund, which is already restoring some important salmon habitat in the Squamish estuary. And when we've recommitted to the BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund, which helps a lot of habitat restoration, and including a project right here on the Sunshine Coast on Chapman Creek. So there's a lot more to do, but I think we all really appreciate having access to some of the most beautiful marine environments in our country and in fact in our world, and some of the incredible work that's being done by our communities, working with all orders of government, is going to be able to ensure that they can be enjoyed for present and future generations.
Thank you, Patrick. Doug, the screen is all yours.
I've got my hand up, Stuart, if you...
Oh, do you? I'm sorry, I
yes.
didn't see it there. Avi, you have your hand up for a wild card. The screen is yours.
Patrick, I appreciate you attacking the Tories. They are in first place. They haven't come to any of the environmental debates, and I think that's disgraceful. But I can't let it go by. It's in the language of my people. It takes a lot of chutzpah for you to cite the conservative record on ocean cleanup of an oil spill when you have defended the Trans Mountain expansion. And when the people of West Vancouver look out at the inlet where there's already a number of tankers every month going through that would turn into more than a tanker a day when that pipeline is finished. And the notion that there could be a spill and that the Liberal government that spent our money, that actually nationalized something, and it was an oil pipeline that even the former Enron executives who started that company couldn't make money on, is just like, sorry, my brain is exploding that you would cite the danger of an oil spill on our precious coastal waters when the Trans Mountain pipeline is opposed by a vast majority of people in this riding, and your government continues to ram it through. It's not okay. And you can't score points on the Tories with something like that because you're doing it. And it's a real problem for people in this coastal community.
Thank you, Avi. Doug, now your turn to take the screen.
Okay, well, Avi is incorrect again. The sale of that oil pipeline made a lot of money for Enron, and it was Canadian taxpayer money that was spent for that purpose. They came out of that deal looking just fine. So, we think that creeks and rivers and streams are essential to sustaining salmon. We're all in favor of this stuff. But again, we're looking at a multifaceted question here, and we need to dig a bit deeper to see what's really going on. Let's have a look at this Future of Howe Sound Biosphere Regional Initiative. This is yet another tentacle of the United Nations, this time operating locally, in the local community, under the UN branch called ICLEI, which is ICLEI.org. So my answer to this question is no, like my previous answer. The People's Party will reduce Canada's participation in the United Nations to the bare minimum. But yet again, we see Avi and the NDP working in concert with these globalist interests to sell out Canadian decision-making and sovereignty. Now, we're not going to have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Michael, I'll ask you to give us the final remarks on this question.
Okay, well, I first of all, I just have to add, I did have my hand up in response to Avi, so I won't take that time right now, but quickly, Avi, it's so ironic that you're giving Patrick a hard time about the TMX, and your own leader, Jagmeet Singh, is now calling it an asset that he will review when he comes to power. In other words, he's going to keep it. And that's so sad to me to hear you and your party. And you've been so thrown out by your party. You came with the LEAP manifesto. You have all your good ideas. You have your personal convictions on environment and climate change. And your party rejected everything about what you brought forward with the LEAP manifesto. They threw it out.
The LEAP resolution passed, Mike, and you know that's true. That's just not true. I'm sorry, that's not true. It passed the convention in Edmonton.
No, it didn't. It passed.
Yes, it did. I was on the floor, Mike. Please, you can't just lie.
All right, I'm not lying. It passed with the proviso that you would study it for 2 years. That was the idea, and nobody did. And it is not policy of any. If the LEAP manifesto is now NDP policy, tell me, is it? Because you know what the LEAP manifesto is? It is that we must stop the TMX pipeline. It is that we must stop fracking. And when Paul Manley stands up in Parliament and asks your leader whether you will stop fracking, he avoids the question and will not say it. He won't say it publicly because he is kowtowing to the TMX and he's kowtowing to fracked gas. And that's the bottom line. Your LEAP manifesto was chucked out because your LEAP manifesto is essentially Green Party policy. Do the comparison as Elizabeth did back in 2015. She put them side by side. I'd love to show you. And you'll see that they rejected everything about it. So it's very difficult for me to hear you give Patrick a hard time. I think actually you should give Patrick some kudos for 30% protected spaces by 2030. That's excellent. I don't think we can argue that Patrick and his predecessor tried very hard on wild salmon. And as for your ideas, they're excellent. A climate youth corps, those are good ideas. The question is accountability, accountability, accountability. And that's what the Green Party voice is going to be about. Should I get into Parliament, it will be to hold people accountable so that promises that are made are kept. And furthermore, if people have good ideas, which you have, I will champion them as well. And I will champion Patrick's ideas. I will champion good ideas that will bring us forward in climate change, but I also will hold people accountable, any politician and myself included accountable, if we do not fulfill our promises. And that's the disappointing part of this whole thing. We have 7 international conventions that we've signed, which we don't uphold, from the Biodiversity Convention to the Sustainable Development Goals. We have so many of these things, climate change after climate change agreement, 9 emissions targets missed. And we're standing here and saying to people that climate change is important. What people should do is give in their hearts the Green Party a chance. We have not governed, but we have been consistent. You will not find one Green Party person who will support the TMX in any way. You won't find them. Not one person who's a candidate right now will stand up and say that. And that's important for people to understand, is that we're consistent. We've been around. 25 years ago, when I was standing up with Elizabeth May, I've told people this, I was walking around with pamphlets that said there will be 3 times the number of forest fires, and today there are. And so what people have to do is listen to us now when we say that it's a climate emergency and we must act and cooperate together, celebrate our good ideas, but certainly we can't stand up and have good ideas that we're not going to follow through on. Now, I know that my time here has gone to that, but what I wanted to mention is that each MP in this question has been tasked with the idea of coming up with what they would personally do. And quickly, I'd like to mention that there are 2 fantastic ideas for How Sound. And one is legal personhood. As they have done in New Zealand with rivers, they've actually given rivers, mountains, and lakes, and we've done it now in Canada. The Inuit have done it in northern Quebec. They've given places legal personhood as we give corporations legal personhood, and that gives them rights. I will champion that in a private member's bill. I will also champion the idea of what Wales has done, which is to establish a future generations commissioner whose sole job is to legislatively look over what people are doing in Parliament to ensure that the rights of future generations are being met. She has the ability to stop and veto projects if they will not serve future generations. We need that in How Sound. We need somebody who will stick up for the personhood of the rivers and mountains of our environment, and will stick up for the future generations who expect to live here in the millenniums that are going to come.
Thank you, Michael. I do not see any hands up at this moment, so I'll go on to our next question, which is from Aware, Whistler's environmental charity. Aware is committed to protecting Whistler's natural environment by speaking up and taking action on environmental issues while empowering others to do the same. So the question is, pre-COVID, Whistler generated 25% of BC's tourism-related GDP. For any community trying to focus on both climate and tourism, the elephant in the room is air travel. What federal level strategies do you employ to tackle travel and tourism related aviation emissions? Doug, this is your territory, so I'm going to allow you to start because you're coming to us from Whistler. Doug, are you there?
You're on mute.
Okay.
Mute. No, that's right. Okay.
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Thank you. So I'll make my comments quite brief here. Now, we recognize that Whistler is a tourist destination, and we need to have tourists come here. And for that reason, and for the reasons I've previously given around our belief that there's no emergent condition vis-a-vis global warming and carbon dioxide, that we find no need to tackle travel and aviation emissions. It's just not necessary. And when we remove these impediments, Whistler will thrive. And that's what I have to say on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug. Brief and to the point. Michael, back to you.
Well, I'm back again. Okay,
Yes,
so on
you
this
are.
one, this is an outstanding question because it sort of points us towards some of the predicaments that we're going to need to figure out and come up with some good solutions. Because aviation and flying people in for tourism is there's no question it's beneficial for the tourism industry, is particularly harmful for climate change because particularly aviation, which emits the 5 greenhouse gases when they're emitted by airplanes up in the air, is particularly problematic, and particularly at night. So you'll notice that in Green Party policy, we try to address those 2 issues. to try and figure out how are we going to not fly planes at night and not fly so many planes, of which pre-COVID there was 10,000 planes in the air at any given time. It's a huge problem. So the question then becomes, what are you going to do? Because if you're a skier, ultimately, if you're on the ski team, you can't smoke cigarettes. And the same thing is true about skiing. If you want to be able to ski, enjoy Whistler's attributes, ski off the peak chair in a deep powder day, the bottom line is we can't have climate change, because a 3.5 degree future will absolutely wipe that out. And that's where we're going in this century. So my daughter, who loves to ski, will not be skiing when she's my age in Whistler, given the current trajectory that we're on. And that's hugely problematic. So we got to come to grips with that and deal with it. And one of the best ways we can deal with it is by being creative. Now, Canada could start to emulate what other countries have done, which is electrify their fleet. We can electrify buses. We can also have the idea that we are pushing in the Green Party to make sure that we have trains, high-speed trains moving around the country. That's entirely possible. If you can move a train in Japan at 200 miles per hour, well, a plane only goes 600. So it's going to take you a third as much time, but you will get there. And so the idea here is that we have to think of a future that we want for Whistler. And it is going to be one in which we're going to have to change the nature of how we move. And we can see that we quickly adapted in COVID. We have been able to deal with a lot fewer plane flights, a lot less transportation. And I would also say that if we change the culture of Canadians so that we celebrate being fit, celebrate actually skiing, celebrate using Whistler, then we can actually have local tourism fill a gap. And if there's anybody who doubts that, please go to Norway, as I have done, and jump on the subway and see how many people are racing up and down to the ski hills, because so many people ski, so many people use their local ski hills, and so many people stay fit and active in a recreation. The same holds true for other communities in our riding, like Squamish, which is the recreation capital of Canada. We can do non-climate or climate-friendly activities. And a classic example are all the kite surfers and windsurfers who crowd there every day. I went down there myself to see them on the spit. That's a benign activity. It's not going to do any harm. And we can't, or the rock climbers are climbing on the rock faces. All of those ideas are things that we can promote, which are benign, non-carbon intensive activities. And they point us towards a very, very fun future.
Thank you, Michael. Abby, I turn the screen over to you.
Thanks, and I appreciate this question, and Mike, I appreciate your vision of winters and the need to protect them. It was very meaningful for me today to get the endorsement of Mike Douglas, the co-founder of Protect Our Winters Canada, and a Whistler institution. So first of all, I think the pandemic has showed us, or sort of pointed to a possible future like the one that Mike is describing, where Whistler can get incredibly busy without so many international tourists, and that local tourism can and must be a real economic driver. But it needs real leadership from all levels of government to make the necessary transition to a less global tourism economy. And that's coming whether we like it or not. And I think there are going to be more pandemics, and we are getting a dress rehearsal for the disastrous future. And we need to use this experience of the emergency that we're in to leverage the big change, to make a big shift, and actually create a better future. Which we know we can do. I mean, first of all, on a very local level, we need an affordable, I would say fare-free electric bus system that connects Vancouver and other places in BC with Whistler and Squamish and Pemberton and all of Sea to Sky. That should be part of an intercity highway public transit and high-speed rail system, which the federal government has to step up and lead as part of what I've been calling for, a Green New Deal, to slash emissions in half, more than in half, in less than a decade, and build a 21st century clean economy in a gigantic hurry. I was really excited to see just the other day that the NDP announced that we would double federal money to municipalities that are investing in electrified transit. And we're committed to a national system of clean public transit by 2030. And the NDP has said moving to fare-free transit wherever municipalities are ready to lead. And I would go further and say that we need the right to mobility is a human right. And we need to make it, there can be no barriers, financial barriers to people moving around. We have to do it by divesting money away from airport expansions, especially those that cater to short and medium distance flights that can be accommodated by those new electric trains and buses. Look, France banned short flights where alternatives exist under 2.5 hours by rail. And we could do something similar in Canada. I mean, we're a much bigger country, but once we have the clean infrastructure rolling out, we need to regulate, actually regulate, and bring to an end the reliance on air travel for short hops. And we have to take the billions of dollars spent on pipelines and fossil fuel subsidies. The Trudeau government has spent $18 billion in 2020, handing over money to the fossil fuel industry, a $20 billion pipeline. That's money that we need to invest in the new technology to get us around. Finally, this is a question of inequality. The 1% of super emitters cause half of all aviation emissions. So we are talking about, who do you trust to take on inequality, to bring in a wealth tax and actually take on the power of the 1% who are emitting half of the aviation emissions? That's got to be part of the solution.
Thank you, Avi. And Patrick, I'll ask you to complete responses to this question.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, first, I think it is a great question, and I just want to tip my hat to the great work that Aware does. I've had a chance to see, them working, cleaning up the parks in Whistler, and I know they do great advocacy work as well. I just want to touch on a few points that were mentioned before. The idea of a high-speed train to Whistler isn't really possible given the grades and given the turns that we have there. But absolutely, our government's been investing in public transit to help move people around. We've invested $18.5 billion in the last 6 years, which is more than 13 times what the Conservatives had invested in. And I've been working, the best that I can to get intercity regional transit in the Sea to Sky, because ever since Greyhound shut down, that's been a huge gap. Our government actually proposed co-financing any of the lines that were shut down, but the province of BC turned it down. And I've been trying to get the Ministry of Transport of BC to finally move ahead with this. And the federal government's a willing partner, but they have not answered those calls yet. I think this question really strikes a key challenge that we have. We want to keep living the way that we do without destroying our climate, but we have to grapple with the emissions that we produce. There are ways we can decarbonize in many cases, but in other cases, we're simply going to need behavioral change. For most of the economy, batteries and electrification are the answer. This is such for homes, for cars, for businesses. But there are parts of our economy that are hard to decarbonize because they require power from an energy-dense source. Aviation is absolutely one of them. We are investing in clean fuels. This will have to be an intermediate solution for some of this. This means biofuels from forestry/agricultural waste, from methane from organic waste, which all emit less than fossil fuels, and in fact can be net negative in some scenarios. In the future, it may also mean hydrogen, where we can make from renewable energy right here in BC. I've heard of some very interesting projects like offshore wind north of Vancouver Island, geothermal project near Pemberton that can generate hydrogen that doesn't produce any emissions. And right in Squamish, the Carbon Engineering is participating in a Natural Resources Canada Aviation Challenge, where they're producing clean fuels for use in aviations, and they're literally able to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into a sustainable fuel. So these are all potential options, but it's not going to solve it alone. I know this is a topic that came up when I had a meeting with Tourism Whistler earlier this year. And when I talked to them about the future of travel, it's going to mean in a lot of cases slower travel. This means focusing on longer trips as opposed to long haul weekend travel. It's going to mean focusing, and this is going to be a challenge. To Mike's point, all of those activities you mentioned, they don't actually bring in a lot of money. So this would mean a huge hit to the tourism sector because people that come from further away actually spend a lot more. But what we brought in earlier this year is the Tourism Relief Fund. It funds destination marketing organizations to, among other things, market sustainable tourism. I think there's an opportunity here. We do need to seize it. And the last thing I'll mention is both aviation and shipping are not included right now in international climate talks. These very much do need to be, because they're now some of our biggest sources of emissions, and action is very much long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I do not see any hands up, so I'm going to move on to our next question, which comes to us from the Sunshine Coast Climate Action Network, a nonpartisan group of concerned citizens who want to do more to slow the progress of climate change. Question is this: forests are a unique and valuable ecosystem on planet Earth. And we know leaving healthy forests intact is a key part of addressing climate. BC is home to some of the last stands of old growth, including right here in our riding. If elected, what would you do as an MP to protect old growth trees from logging and design and implement new practices for sustainable forestry? I will start. I turn the screen back to you, Avi. I'd like to start with you.
Thank you. I was pleased to see the federal government, the Liberal Party, at least in this election, enter this sphere, but I thought it was a little cynical, having done nothing to protect old growth forests over the last 6 years, that the Trudeau government started riding in when they saw a wedge with the BC NDP government. Mike earlier accused me of arresting protesters in Fairy Creek. I know you were carried on the wings of rhetorical excess, Mike, and I'm going to forgive you for that one. I have stood with protesters against the logging there, and people know in the riding know my position that not one more elder of the forest should be cut down under any circumstances. I actually think it goes deeper than that, and this is why I'm running for federal office, just to be clear, not provincial office, because I think the federal government is the level of government that has the power and resources to shift the basis of the economy and a lot of these zero-sum games in what is really the last dregs of extractivism in Canada, whether it's logging or fishing or fossil fuels. We are pitting people against each other over the last of the resources, and it needs to stop instantly. And a place where you really see this clearly is in the BC government's own strategic review on old growth logging, which we've talked about before in these conversations. It's an excellent document. And it talks about the primacy of involving First Nations in all decisions around old growth, in deferring all logging until parties can come to the table and work it out. That should happen immediately, I believe, in the recommendations, which should all be implemented. The BC government has committed to implementing all those recommendations. It needs to happen. But more fundamentally, that we need a paradigm shift, that we have to stop seeing old growth trees as a commodity to turn into money and start seeing them as what they are, communities, the life support system of the forest. I was in the forest and just by my house up by Trout Lake here just yesterday with Ross Muirhead from the Elphinstone Logging Focus. And he was showing me this beautiful fir forest, which is not old growth, trees up to 100 years old that came up when the big cedars were hand cut 100 years ago. This is a mature, beautiful, vibrant, biodiverse ecosystem where the alders speak to the firs through their roots, exchanging nitrogen for water. And we know from the research of Suzanne Simard, the great BC scientist, that trees talk to each other, that they warn each other of danger, that they are the guardians of life in our ecosystem. And we need to start valuing them for that. So the programs that we're talking about, the Civilian Climate Corps, the Indigenous Guardian Fund, many of the ideas that are circulating in this debate go to the heart of the matter. We need economic pathways, family supporting jobs, careers for First Nations, for settler society that rely on protecting nature, sequestering carbon, and not further ravaging that tiny amount that is left to us. It's a sacred trust. We have to defend it. And I will fight every day for that if I'm elected. And I think that we need the deeper change of that paradigm shift, because it's a worldview that is sucking away the last of our natural bounty, of the natural bounty that we rely on, the life support systems on Earth. We need to see an economy that's based on caring for the Earth. And we have some of the ideas. We got to get to work implementing them in a hurry.
Thank you, Avi. I would now like to turn the screen over to Doug.
Thank you. Patrick is quite correct about the energy density of fuels as it relates to air travel. And the problem with batteries, of course, is that they have to include the containment of them, which includes a lot of metals and other things that weigh a lot. So it's not just the energy density, it's the overall energy to weight of the proposed solution. There are a few, budding ideas for electric aircraft. It's all short haul stuff. And so longer flights are going to require, a good fuel source. And there really is no alternative at this point. Now, the idea that winter is going to disappear and affect winter tourism in Whistler, it simply isn't borne out by the facts. We have, a lot of press reports, front and center on news these days about, all these terrible forest fires and, the weather changes. The fact of the matter is it was hotter in the 1930s. Half of the province was on fire back then. And all of the predictions of gloom and doom about polar ice caps melting simply haven't come true. And I'd challenge anybody else here to give me an updated estimate of when exactly it is that the polar ice caps will be gone from the Earth. This has been forecast for decades. And in fact, the polar ice caps are growing now. And a lot of these other things, maybe you've heard of Patrick Moore. I'm going to hold this up here. Fake invisible catastrophes and threats of doom. Patrick Moore. It details a lot of these scaremongering stories, everything from, global warming to the death of the baobab trees, to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which has recovered nicely, to the imminent death of polar bears, which have now recovered to the point where they're actually a nuisance to our Inuit populations. And then we get the nonsense about the heat wave here in the Pacific Northwest, which is real, obviously, but they neglect entirely to point out that the Southern Hemisphere is extraordinarily cold, from snow in South Africa to crop failures in South America to, unseasonable cold temperatures in Australia and New Zealand. These things just aren't happening the way they're claimed to. Logging is a sustainable activity. I think there's a good case to be made, to preserve old growth forests on the basis of biodiversity, but as a mitigating factor against carbon dioxide, which probably isn't all that important. I think the old growth forest argument simply falls flat. Thanks. I guess I'm out of time there.
Thank you, Doug. Patrick, I would now ask you to take the screen.
Thanks, Stuart. Well, first, I just want to mention, I think those are it's a great story from Avi, but unfortunately, that's not the NDP policy at all. The NDP won't push their provincial counterparts on this, and that's why it's not in their plan. But for the life of me, I cannot understand why it's not in the Greens platform either. And as someone who's grown up and lived in BC most of my life, I've been able to visit conservation areas right across our province. Some of my most memorable memories are camping in old growth forests, including in wonderful places like Carmona Valley. And that instilled within me a deep appreciation from a young age that I hope current and future generations will be able to experience. And old growth is so incredibly important for a number of reasons, for carbon sequestration, for intrinsic value, for culture, for species at risk. But as you mentioned, they're under threat. We only have 2.7% left in our province, and the province continues to log them. I've been an advocate in the community. I've gone on trips with ELF to Dakota Ridge. I've lobbied our MLA to protect it. And after that trip, the province did in fact defer that off the cut block. I've also presented petitions in the House of Commons on this issue in coordination with Green MP Paul Manley. But we are the only federal party that has a plan to protect old growths in British Columbia. This is one of the platform pieces that I directly worked on and very pleased to see included in it. So what we are proposing is to reach a nature agreement with the province of BC to protect the province's old growth forest and protect and expand protected areas. We're going to establish a $50 million fund and ensure First Nations, local communities, and workers are partners in shaping the path forward on nature protection. And this actually follows some incredible work we've been doing over the last 4 years, or the last 3 years rather, where we've invested $4.6 billion in nature conservation to make sure we're on a track to protect 30% of our land by 2030. And already an area double the size of Nova Scotia has been protected in this time. And there's areas within our riding, the Rhine River Conservation Area, where we do have old growth that has been protected just last year as well. So on top of this, we are moving forward with creating 10 new national parks, 10 new marine protected areas, and we're going to double the size of our existing nature parks and marine protected area system in Canada. So there's a lot of really important work to do here. We have tremendous old growth forest, even within our riding on the Sunshine Coast and the Sea to Sky. Even in Cyprus, we have an incredible old growth conservation area that I really hope that everybody on this call is able to take a tour on at some point, because there's nothing like actually being in an old growth forest to develop that appreciation within you. And I think it's so important that we expose Canadians at a young age to do this, to make sure that we're going to have those future leaders in conservation and sustainability so that we can protect this incredibly valuable resource.
Thank you, Patrick. And Michael, I'll ask you to wrap up responses to this question about forestry and old growth.
Sure, and it's a fantastic question because unequivocally the Greens are into stopping old growth logging. There's plenty of written material on this, and you can, as you said, just check out what Paul Manley has done on this file, Patrick, and you'll see very quickly that we have always said that old growth is important, and we have championed it on so many occasions. Look, the main thing here is that when we look at how we look at forests, there's a fundamental problem, and it shows up in how jurisdiction works for old growth forests. It works as if it is forestry only, as if our ecosystems of old growth are only standing timber. So therefore they fall under the forestry provisions of the provincial jurisdiction, and the Fed, as a federal MP, you may think that you have no ability to actually affect forestry. And in fact, we do if we change our view as to what is an ecosystem and what is an old growth forest. Because an old growth forest is not just standing timber. It is not just timber value. It is not volume of cubic meters per foot. It's actually an entire ecosystem, which represents a carbon sink. It represents the highest biodiversity values in Canada. 50% of all of Canada's biodiversity is in British Columbia, and our temperate rainforests, particularly our old growth temperate rainforests, which in some cases have taken up thousands of years to be able to get to the climax state that they are, in which there are so many different kinds of plants, animals, and organisms. Those are so precious at this point from a global perspective that we absolutely cannot leave it up to a provincial NDP government. And by the way, Avi, I know you keep trying to get out of this, but if you're NDP, you're a card-carrying member of both those parties, so you are responsible. Anybody who's NDP has to come to grips with John Horgan and what he's doing in Fairy Creek now, arresting over 800 people who are desperately trying to state what we all know, which is that our old growth forests are of global significance. It's not even for us as Canadians to cut them down anymore, because there are so few places left on the planet that have those temperate rainforests. We've got them in the Kamchatka Peninsula, down in Patagonia, and we've got them in Canada on the West Coast. I personally have been involved in this for a long time. I made the first film on Clayoquot Sound, on Carmana Creek Valley of the Giants, on Kitlope, on the Stein. I've made so many films on forestry, and the key thing that I've understood from this, after all of those films, is that we think that we can manage forests. But as Herb Hammond has pointed out, and so many ecosystem-based ecologists have pointed out, those forests are managing us. It's the other way around. This is where Indigenous knowledge will do us so much good, because we recognize that we can't just manage forests. We're part of an ecosystem that at the end of the day is taking care of us. And the proof is in the pudding right now, because we've cut down more than 50% of the world's forests. When I've been in West Africa, I've seen the devastation. All of the forests gone. I tried to protect the last of the Cross River rainforest, and we succeeded in under 2 years to stop the logging of those forests. The same is true of the work I've done in the Amazon, where we managed to be able to uphold the largest First Nations concession. It was the Keros Amazonicus who locked up the largest area of Amazon rainforest under their control. And it was done because under the auspices of it being of global significance, something that it's the lungs of the rainforest, just as our temperate rainforest is the carbon sink of the planet. The Amazon is the lungs of the planet. And when we look at all that experience that I've had with this, I can unequivocally state that whoever came up with the question is dead on the money. If we want to solve climate change, we have to treat those forests as if they are more precious standing than if we cut them down, because they are. That's the bottom line.
Thank you, Michael. We're moving a little bit ahead of time, so I'm going to go slightly off script here just a little bit, because I can't help but think, as an MP, and Patrick, you know this because you're an MP right now, you go there as one voice in caucus, not even necessarily in cabinet. But for each one of you, what is the most pressing environmental issue in our riding, and how do you hope to influence Ottawa to pay attention to that and actually do something about it? Michael, I'll start with you.
Well, I'll start by saying that one of the things that we are encouraged to do from the United Nations, as we try to move towards what's called Agenda 2030, or the plan to get to the year 2030, all nations have come together and signed this, as Canada, and everybody says the same thing. We cannot silo issues. Even climate change cannot be seen on its own. We have to be able to see that there's an interconnection between some of the problems that we face. So for example, poverty is interconnected to climate change. You can't solve one without solving the other, right? The same thing is true of gender equality, where we can't tackle riparian ecosystems as if they're not connected to the forest. We can't save our salmon in Howe Sound if we don't understand that they're intrinsically connected to the land and the forest and the health of our forest ecosystems, which is in turn connected to climate change. So this becomes very difficult because we actually have to take that holistic view and not take a problem and say, what's the single most important problem in Howe Sound, but realize that each one of these problems is interconnected. Even sustainable economic growth, which has been identified by the United Nations, is something that we need to figure out, because how are we going to make it through the future? How are we going to make it through the future of global pandemics, which is goal 3, health and well-being, comes under 3.3, communicable diseases. These things have been identified as being absolutely intrinsically connected to each other. And that if you can't figure out, for example, poverty, how are you going to tackle communicable diseases like COVID? And we know we have lots of examples of that. So my point here, to your question, which is that we should not separate these items, but as MPs, understand that it's our job to see the whole picture, the big picture, and to see it at scale. And to understand that if you're going to solve something in Howe Sound, you have to have both a provincial, a national, and a global hat on to be able to see that you can't solve some of these problems in Howe Sound without understanding what's going on the other side of the planet. And that's particularly important when we see something like COVID, which you can't solve here in Canada alone. However much Doug would like it solved here in Canada alone, you need a global hat. You need to tackle it from a multilateral perspective. And the same is true of climate change. So our duty in this riding is to do our part to tackle some of those big picture problems. And that includes shutting down LNG. In our riding, shut it down. It means stopping fracked gas so that it doesn't come from the Blueberry Nation up north, and so we can respect and uphold UNDRIP. You see how they're connected? All of these things are connected, and they're going to require an MP who understands that and is able to put those connections together. And at the end of the day, even follow the money. We've had lots of good ideas tonight, but the government and all 3 of the other parties are willing to spend $77 billion on fighter jets. And then they say there's no money for some of the solutions that we want, like a fast train or an electric car. And that's what I promise you I will do, is make those connections.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Doug, over to you. What do you see as being the pressing issue, and how are you going to do something about it if you're elected?
The pressing issue in this election is the creeping control of the United Nations into Canadian sovereignty and the use of COVID to control people through this vaccine passport. I'll talk more about that later. Let's get back to this topic today of environmental stuff. Mike mentioned that there's 5 greenhouse gases, and he's correct, there are. And carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. In fact, the most recent revision of the IPCC document, AR6, shows that of the greenhouse gas contribution to warming, whatever that may be, carbon dioxide makes up less than 50%. The other greenhouse gases actually contribute more. So it should be clear that the IPCC is probably barking up the wrong tree by pursuing carbon dioxide emissions to the exclusion of other greenhouse gases. Conservation and preservation is important, no doubt about it. But the idea that the federal government can come in on a white horse and fix all these things is just another proposed intrusion into federal power into provincial matters. And in Canada, we're actually facing a crisis of unity as well as a number of other problems. I mean, we talk about climate crisis. We have other crises here that need to be addressed as well. And national unity is one. The Liberals have, and the People's Party actually has a plan to address this. And Max has called it radical decentralization, where the federal government would devolve powers to the provinces largely to the extent that Quebec has, and even more. And this will allow the provinces to control their own destinies. It's consistent with our view of personal independence and freedom. And such things have to be decided again at the provincial level. So we've got things like provincial police force, pension plan to make sure your civil servants are taken care of. All these things have to be in place. And that takes, a premier of a province that's in agreement with this, just like they are in Quebec. And so we don't think that we should intrude any further into provincial jurisdiction. We think this is a source of division in this country, and we need to back off, defang Ottawa, and let the provinces handle their own affairs, including resources and other things like that.
Thank you, Doug.
That's it for my time. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Abby, I'll come back to this question to you, because I'm sure that it's one that you think about a lot, that you can influence change. How would you do so? And what is that issue that you think is forefront that you want to take to Ottawa?
I appreciate this question. And I'm running because we're in a climate emergency. I appreciate, Mike, I appreciate the holistic way that you look at connecting issues. I think we've been in these conversations together, and this has been precisely the focus of my work since the LEAP Manifesto and the LEAP and the organization that bore its name, and my work on the Green New Deal in the United States and bringing those ideas back to Canada. But we're in a state of emergency, and we have a surfacing now, particularly here in this riding and in British Columbia, where people are starting to feel the crisis on the surface of our skin. The climate emergency is stuck in the back of our throats in smoke season. And and people are crying over the loss of life in the heat dome. And we know that this is no longer an issue among issues. And one of the things that's telling us that, and telling us that the capacity for gigantic change, which we know from the science is necessary, is actually possible, is the pandemic itself. And I think that in the climate movement for 30 years, one of our biggest problems has been the barrier that people don't believe that gigantic change is possible. And so we get incrementalism like we've had from the Liberals. We get little changes and doing what's possible. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. All of the ways in which our ambition is systematically diminished when we know that we need big change in all aspects of society. Then the pandemic comes along. People think that big change is impossible, and our lives are turned upside down overnight. And suddenly, for the last 18 months, we have known in our families, in our homes, in our lives, what it's like to live in a state of emergency. And the government has spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to keep the economy from collapsing in an emergency. I think a lot of that money was misspent. There was a lot of what my grandfather David Lewis called corporate welfare bums feeding at the public trough, Air Canada executives, profitable corporations benefiting from the wage subsidy, share buybacks, and corporate excess. But we learned that Canada is a wealthy country, and that in a time of emergency, we have the capacity, and the federal government has the power and the responsibility, and people expect the federal government to step up and support people in an emergency. So we've got gigantic changes to make. I can't wait to get to the House of Commons and start shaking up the entire political establishment. And yes, I'm ready to make some changes and really push members of my own caucus. We need that. We need people who are prepared to speak the truth about the level of change that we need, and speak the truth about the exciting, incredible opportunities that big change will bring in when we start getting serious about solving the problems, the crises that we face at scale and at speed. I've been putting Ottawa politicians on the spot as a journalist since the beginning of my career in the 1990s. I forced Jason Kenney on CBC in the election of 2000 to admit that he was for privatized two-tier healthcare. And that election ended up turning on that issue. I don't take pride in helping elect Liberals. It was not intentional, but they're not happy that I'm coming to Ottawa. People in power have been, are not excited about the prospect of having me in the fold. And that's precisely why I want to go there. We need to shake things up. I have a lovely life here as many people in this community do. I don't want to be searching for an apartment in Ottawa. I'm doing this because we all need to do whatever we can and get out of our comfort zones and act like it's an emergency and that our house is on fire and start putting big change on the table. That's number one priority. That's the everyday priority. That's why I'm doing this.
Thank you, Avi. And Patrick, I'd like you to wrap up because you're in that situation right now. You are the current representative for the riding. You go to Ottawa and you know that it's very difficult to take local issues to Ottawa. What if re-elected, how are you going to do with regards to the environmental issues in our riding, and how are you going to influence that change in the capital?
Well, I think, Stuart, I think it's a great question, and I can speak from experience from what I've been doing for the last couple of years. We all have a voice as the MP for a riding, but you have a much bigger voice when you're an MP in the government. And I've worked over the last year and a half to really take new leadership roles. I'm currently the chair of our caucus in British Columbia, which, as I mentioned before, gives me the opportunity every week in our national caucus to speak directly to the Prime Minister and our cabinet and our entire caucus, where I get to raise issues of provincial concern as well as local concern. And I've used that platform to advocate for what I mentioned earlier, the largest recovery package for species in the history of our country, which was for salmon. And that is an issue that directly affects our riding as much as any other. When we've seen salmon stocks decline by up to 93% in many parts. And I still think that is a huge issue that we need to continue to implement with that money that we've set aside through the budget. And we need to focus on some local riparian area management. And I do like the way that Mike framed it earlier, because all these things we're talking about, they all, of course, fit together. And we need to start looking at some of the environmental issues we have, not in silos, but in terms of ecosystems and how we're going to manage things with that in mind. And I think you have a very different platform when you're within government than when you're not in government. And it's not to say that you do not have power if you're an opposition party, but you don't have the power to, or the ability to, call up the cabinet minister and get a meeting and to be able to push them day in, day out to make it happen. So I just want to remind people of that. That's why it is important to have somebody representing you within government. I think the other big issue that we're facing throughout our riding is just adapting to the climate changes that are already happening. This summer was a great example, or horrible example, I should say, of how we need to be more prepared and how we need to have infrastructure that's resilient to this. Whether it's, we were fortunate to really avoid wildfires locally, but it was flash floods happening in Pemberton. It's the water shortages that we're seeing on the Sunshine Coast. And we have a major, we need to catch up with some of the changes that we're already seeing, even as we're working towards mitigating some of the worst impacts of climate in the best way that we can locally and the best way we can in advocating for action globally. So those are some of the biggest issues that I see. I would say that I get lobbied more than any other stakeholder group by environmental NGOs. I know they do tremendous work and they're able to inform the policy that I'm able to advocate for. I can speak personally that I've met with probably more Angos than any other MP other than Jonathan Wilkinson. And meetings I've had with My Sea to Sky has connected me to organizations like the IISD, which has been able to inform my advocacy on things like fossil fuel subsidies, where I've been able to push our government to commit to getting rid of those 2 full years earlier than our G20 commitment. So that's what I'm going to continue to do, continue to meet with all these experts on the ground, continue to advocate for the issues that we're seeing within our riding, and take that to use the platforms that I have and to be able to influence policy through getting things in the budget, as well as being able to make changes to existing legislation.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm now, my interjection and going off script is pushing us closer to our completion time, but maybe we might wind up going just a little bit longer as we go to our closing remarks of each candidate, which they have been asked to frame their response to a question from a young staff member of Ocean Ambassador Canada. And this group works to connect people with the ocean, to educate them on the health of our ocean, and to inspire them to take meaningful action. So here's the question. As a young adult in my early 20s, thinking about my future, I find it difficult to find optimism. If I have children, what kind of world will they be faced with? Will it be sustainable? I worry that action on climate is much too slow and that we are running out of time. What is your message to youth in our riding and to all Canadian youth? Avi, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, and a wonderful question to end on. First of all, I want to acknowledge the youth movements, ocean ambassadors, climate strikers, and many others who have been leading the climate movement in recent years. But I don't want to thank young people or offer my gratitude. I think young people should be angry. And I think they are, that their elders have squandered these precious years and decades since we knew the truth of the climate crisis. And in a country like Canada, we've subsidized profitable fossil fuel corporations. We've nationalized pipelines. We've generally done everything but what we needed to do to bend the curve on emissions. On the question of optimism and hope, I also want to acknowledge the deep climate grief and anxiety afflicting all of us, especially young people these days. It's profound. People need a way to be sad, to grieve for everything that we're losing, and to face that fear and that sadness in honesty and with support from all of us. I think we have to make a crucial distinction. For me, optimism is the belief that things will turn out well. And I find it incredibly hard to be optimistic in a province like ours that lost 569 human souls in the heat dome, the first mass casualty event of the climate emergency era, in a time when towns burned to the ground and young people watched their parents argue over what to pack in the go bag by the door. That's different from having hope. For me, hope is a choice about what kind of spirit we bring to this work. And I think hope is a responsibility, because the spirit of hope is contagious and we have to infuse our activism with it, all of us. The truth is, to return to what I said at the beginning of this debate, we are on the cusp of huge change, whether we like it or not. Either we rise to the challenge of the climate emergency and we bring in a Green New Deal for all, or we face the unraveling of natural systems on which our modern society and all life depends. So I am hopeful. I know that we can come together. I felt it in the work that I've done. I want to bring people together in that all-in people's movement that my grandfather, David Lewis, was calling for in the 1940s. We need a Green New Deal that slashes our emissions at least in half in less than a decade and creates millions of good family-supporting jobs in all of the new housing and the new transportation and the new energy systems that we need. And that includes a huge increase in employment in the care economy. Care, the connective tissue of our body politic. We need universal affordable childcare, elder care that cherishes our precious elders and creates dignified work for the people who care for them. By the way, those are all green jobs. Care work is climate work, and we must center vulnerable communities in the new economy that we're building. This recognition is rising all over this land. I'll be speaking at the Canada's on Fire rally tomorrow in Squamish. I was pleased to see that my partner, Naomi Klein, has also been asked to speak. I know others have, and I urge all of you in Sea to Sky to come out. There's other rallies on the Sunshine Coast and elsewhere, and in Vancouver, of course. So yeah, I'm hopeful. And I urge everyone watching tonight to embed that spirit of hope in our struggle. We can either choose hope and transformation in our society, or we can succumb to despair and have horrific, huge changes thrust upon us. Young people are leading the existential struggle of confronting the climate emergency. It is hard and scary work, but it is also filled with meaning, community, connection, and common purpose, the spirit of mobilization that we need to change everything. So win or lose, on September 20th, I am honored to be part of this struggle for climate justice, and I will fight every day with everything I've got, whether I'm in the House of Commons or whether I'm outside the gates with the young people pushing their way in. Thank you so much.
My sound was muted. Apologies for that. Thank you, Avi. Doug, I now turn the screen over to you.
Well, the future really is for the youth, and it's going to affect them far more than those of us who are a little older and getting on in life. And so the decisions we make today, one way or the other, are going to have great impact on future generations. There's no question about that. The the message I think that People's Party brings is one of hope. The simple fact is that all these predictions of gloom and doom really haven't come true in the past, and they won't come true in the future. It's highly unlikely, and if they do, we'll find ways to adapt. I would encourage all of you to go on my website. It's bebppc.ca under the climate tab, and you'll find a lot of videos there that will provide the other side of the story. If you have just 5 minutes to spend, I would recommend the video by Dr. Richard T. Lindzen. He's Emeritus Professor of Atmospheric Physics at MIT, and he lays out the issues in very non-technical terms, who the players are, who stands to benefit from politicians, to the media, to environmental groups that are profiting at the expense of the taxpayer. And so I think that we're going to have a period here where we're going to live through these bad policies that are going to hurt everybody. And eventually it's going to become clear, as it is with the ice caps growing now, that these prophecies of doom simply aren't going to materialize. Until then, we're going to suffer a bit. And so I'm going to say in my closing remarks that as regards the Liberal government, from the SNC-Lavalin affair to the Aga Khan affair, to the WE charity scandal, to their latest attempt to nullify Parliament through the courts in order to avoid producing incriminating documents that would implicate the Winnipeg laboratory in the COVID mess, the Liberals have shown contempt for the Canadian people, for our democratic processes, and have left us with the clear impression that they evaluate every program on the basis of whether or not it can be used for their own benefit. There's no reason to believe the promises they make here today will be any different. Simply put, they do not deserve another term in office. When our leader, Maxime Bernier, quit the Conservative Party, the Conservatives aren't here, obviously, he called it intellectually and morally corrupt. It didn't take long for the CPC to prove him correct. They hired former Liberal mudslinger Warren Kinsella at over $20,000 a month to run a smear campaign against us. Kinsella is now the subject of a defamation lawsuit for falsely labeling us as racists. In fact, the People's Party is running candidates of every ethnicity, every color, and every orientation. The charges are false. I can tell you for a fact that our head policy writer is a gay man, but the most important thing about him is not that he's gay. The most important thing is that he writes good policy succinctly and eloquently in both official languages. The People's Party is the party of freedom. We believe in small government and the sanctity of individual rights. Foremost among these is the right to free speech, without which a citizenry cannot stand in peaceful opposition to government coercion. And without that, democracy fails. The People's Party is the sensible, in fact, the only alternative to the corruption in Ottawa, and the Conservatives are just trying to get back to the trough to feed there, and by the time they ultimately get there, the trough is likely to be empty anyways, and the policies of the NDP and the Greens will be destructive to our prosperity and should not be adopted by Canada. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Doug. Michael, to you next, followed by Patrick. I'll call on you, Patrick, once Michael wraps up.
Thank you. Well, to the young person who asked this question, I must say that your question plagues me every day because I have a 9-year-old daughter. And I think that so many young people, I talk to them about this climate angst that Avi has talked about. And I think for anybody who is young today and who is aware of the facts and understands the heat dome or understands the intertidal zone that just got whacked or is smelling the smoke, anybody who is awake to the facts of how much our planet is changing in your lifetime, anybody who understands what 3.5 degree means on the graph, anybody who understands that we're going to exceed 1.5 because we're on a trajectory right now that's sending us right through the roof, anybody who gets that is going to ask that same question in their heart that you just asked. And I'm now, if you want, watch my TED Talk on this, because I actually have a TED Talk on this exact subject. And it basically goes like this. I will look you in the eyes. I will tell you the truth. Because what Lao Tzu said in The Art of War is he said, if your troops are outnumbered and you're really going to lose a battle, the best thing you can do is look them in the eyes and tell them, hey, we're going to lose. Because you know what happens? You will radicalize. You will think differently. I'm done with politicians standing up and promising that they know the answers. And if they only just listen to their policies and so on, it'll all work out. I'll tell you, as a Green Party person, we have absolutely fantastic policies, and I don't know if they're going to work out. That's why I'm so anxious to hear what other people have to say. That's why I'm so anxious to cooperate, to find any good ideas and search the planet for the best ideas, because to be dead honest, we have one of the toughest paths ahead that we could ever imagine. And on the issue of hope, I will say, yes, we do need hope. We desperately need hope, but we also need to be able to embrace what it feels like in your heart to face the facts. Because if you do, and you let the crutch of hope go away for just 5 minutes, give yourself the opportunity to sit with the idea that the path we're on means you're not going to make it. And I'll look you in the eyes and I'll tell you that. I'm happy to do it because I've been in the most polluted, most desperate places on the planet, from the Niger Delta, where they have 300 oil spills, where I've been there where they're bunkering oil and it's spilling all over the mangrove swamps, or go to the Amazon where they're burning it every day. You can watch it burn now. Just turn your TV on. My point is this, is that if you embrace that feeling of what it is like to love your planet and your environment so much that you will not let that happen, then you will radicalize. You will start to want to be in Parliament. You will start to want to bang on the doors of every single decision maker in this country to speed up the process and take action. And at the same time, if you embrace hope, hold hope at the same time that you hold this desperate hopelessness that Abby is so reluctant to take, hold them both at the same time. Transcend and include both of these feelings, and you will become one of the most powerful decision makers, one of the most formidable subjects, one of the most formidable young people, and you will epitomize the youth movement that is standing up in every part of the world right now and demanding change, saying nobody has the right to take this away from future generations. Nobody has the right to not treat our environment as if it was a legitimate, sentient being that deserves our respect. So you're hearing in my voice a certain demanding, like angry energy, but that's what'll happen if you let that feeling move from despair, let the juice of it sit with you, and then grab hope at the same time, because hope on its own is not cutting it these days, because you know it's looking pretty darn hopeless. So I'll say that, and I'll say it with compassion, because I know how difficult it is to take on that feeling. I know how hard it is, because it's so, everybody's going to tell you, just don't feel that. Just don't feel that. Just don't feel that. But I know that in your heart, you know that. And so what we have to do is feel it, absolutely feel it, juice the feeling, and then realize that at the end of the day, it's not over till it's over. And I can say that as a person who's been machine guns to the stomach. So many times I thought I'm done, hanging out of Greenpeace helicopters. I've done so many things that are so dangerous and thought, oh, this is it, I'm done. And at the end of the day, it's not over till it's over. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind. It's not over till it's over.
Thank you, Michael. And Patrick, closing remarks from you.
Thanks, Stuart. To young people, I would say this: I feel you and I hear you. I grew up watching Canada miss every single emissions reduction target it ever set. We were literally an international pariah on the climate file, not only for doing nothing within Canada, but also for actively disrupting progress at global negotiations. You may not remember that, but that's what life was like under the Conservatives. And I was in my early 20s in those years, and that's why I became an environmental lawyer. And I do want to be clear, the situation is urgent, but it's not too late. But with the government that will be elected with this election, we'll have to make the decisions that will get us to where we need to go. We need the government to take concerted action. We can't turn back, but you have the power. Every year, there are more young voters who care deeply about the environment. Every year, a new cohort of kids who grew up knowing the truth of climate change turns 18. And you have a voice even if you can't vote. You just have to look at Greta Thunberg. Look at the climate protests around the world. This is your moment. And you can talk to your parents. You can express the threat it poses to you and to your future. And your government needs to answer to you. And that's why I've never turned down an opportunity to speak to youth. So as you're exercising this newfound power, be sure to do your homework. Beware of political parties who make promises and set targets without having a clear plan of reaching them and without subjecting their plans to any scrutiny. Beware of those that brand themselves as climate champions without experience in affecting change in practice. listen to the experts. When it comes to climate change, there is no higher authority than the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The scientists, authors, and economists of IPCC are the ones we all rely on to track and to project climate change. They suggest solutions and press governments to adopt them. And that's why Andrew Weaver, the former BC Green leader, and Mark Jacquard, SFU professors, and both IPCC authors endorsed our plan. Because the Conservative plan is a plan to roll back climate action. The NDP and Green plans have very nice wish lists, but they haven't shown their work. We have no idea how they plan on hitting their targets. And I have nothing but respect for Avi and Mike. We know they care a lot. They've dedicated years to the climate fight, but the problem is their parties don't have plans, and their parties are not vying to be the government where they could deliver on it anyways. And the scientists themselves have said so. So we have two choices. We can go forward with the Liberal plan, which is both ambitious and achievable. It will create hundreds of thousands of jobs while we reduce our emissions in line with what the science is telling us we must do. Or we can go backwards with the Conservative plan, which will roll back action to the dark Harper years where we were an international embarrassment on the file. And I know you all care so deeply about this. You're frustrated, you're angry. It's your future. It's mine too. I got my first gray hairs, but I'm not that old. And that's why I'm going to be there at the climate rally tomorrow in Squamish too. When time came to run for office, I chose a Liberal Party, not because we had the best slogans, because frankly, our communications are awful, but because we had the best plan. For the first time in Canada's history, we have an independently verified, costed and modeled plan to achieve our targets. With legislation I directly worked on and strengthened, we've set emissions reduction targets every 5 years that are consistent and holding our word to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We need to report on it regularly and transparently. For the Conservatives to now roll this back would put us in the dubious company of the Trump administration, Syria, and Venezuela. We can't have that, and our future can't have that. So our plan is real, our leaders are sincere, we have real momentum in the fight against climate change, and we can't go back now. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank all of you for coming this evening as candidates and demonstrating how much a focus on the environment is important to you, your campaigns, and governments moving forward. And as we wrap up this exceptional evening, I'm reminded of the words of Chief Dan George of the Tsleil-Waututh, who talked on the beauty of this land, of the beauty of the trees, the softness of the air, the fragrance of the grass. And he said, they speak to me. The trail of the sun and the life that never goes away, they speak to me, and my heart soars. And for me, the beauty of Mother Nature, her power and grace provided all of us with our home, a home in space that is rocketing around the sun through the universe. And while we have no control over the direction we're traveling in space, we do have complete control over how we choose to manage and nurture the resources of this planet. The collective will to change course, to move away from the burning of fossil fuels for energy, and at the same time enhancing and expanding our ability to capture and sequester carbon, to create alternative forms of energy that include but are not limited to wind and solar, continues to grow. So thank you to all of you, our candidates, those who submitted questions, and you who joined us online. And I want to sign off by quoting just a couple lines from Michael Jackson's song, We Are the World. He says, there comes a time when we need to heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one. There's a choice we're making, and it's true, we'll make a better day. Good night.